I want to thank all of you for coming. I see a lot of new faces, some familiar ones. I'm Pat Sides, the archivist here, and I'm responsible for taking care of our wonderful historical treasures here at Willard. And one thing that we have a lot of is old pictures, tens of thousands of old pictures of Evansville, and I like to put them together into programs so people can visualize what the past looked like. Often you see things that you recognize, and you may see things that you don't remember or don't recognize because maybe they're no longer here. But anyway, I find that people love looking at old pictures and hearing about our city. And so tonight we'll be talking about the West Franklin Street Historic District, sometimes called the Independence Historic District. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. Before I get started though, I put out some brochures near the door. I think they're largely gone now, but I will announce that in just a couple of weeks we have another program. The one being held tonight is in conjunction with Historic Preservation Month in collaboration with the Historic Preservation Office here in Evansville. And in a couple of weeks, we have Harold Morgan. I think a lot of you know him or have been to some of his programs. He's a wonderful speaker and researcher, and he will be doing one to commemorate the Normandy invasion. Ooh. And you know, he loves World War II history. He's published at least a couple books. Homefront Heroes was his first one. And he's been here a number of times talking about, well, different aspects of Evansville during the war, Republic Aviation, and other programs like that. So you won't want to miss that one. And also there's some brochures for one big annual event here at Willard, which is Midnight Madness. If you're a genealogist or want to get started on researching your family history, that's a good week to start. We're open, it's the third full week of June, and it runs all that week, Monday through Friday. We open at 9 a.m. and we close at midnight, those 5 days of the week, so you can get a lot of research in. We have a lot of speakers coming in, a lot of special things going on if you can come at that time. I guess we're about ready then. It always seems like there's something else. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, or you can ask also afterwards. I'm trying to keep, because some people ask how long the program is, I try to keep it to roughly an hour, give or take a couple of minutes, because I know people need to leave sometimes, or you know, for different reasons. So, so I think we'll go ahead and get started now. I've turned off all the lights, well, except for a little in the back, trying to brighten up the screen a little bit. Facing the west, we get all that sun, although it does light up. Willard Carpenter up there, if you don't know who that is, it's about an hour ago, he was really lit up. I thought he was in a blaze of glory, and he likes to watch over all the patrons who are still coming to his library. Over 100 years old, or over 100 years since he built it. You might not like something if I remember to say it, I'll say it here in a few minutes once I get started. But, well, you can probably recognize there's something about West Franklin Street. You know, as old as the picture might be, there's something always recognizable about it. It's one of those places, maybe one of the few places, or only place in Evansville that it changes, yet it doesn't change. It's recognizable, and a lot of people like that. And does anybody recognize the block here?
Where that clock is that where Old National Bank is?
No, First Bevel. It's First Bevel. Yeah, one of two large banks on that street now. And of course, one of the most recognizable buildings sort of faded into the picture here. It's like, you can see it's a sort of a hazy, foggy, rainy day. but there's the Gerst House, which sort of orients everybody. Everybody knows where that is, partly because of its size, I think. So you're looking east here. This is, I think, about the 2200 block. I decided to give my program the subtitle "On the Other Side of the Creek" because while I was doing my research, I came across this interesting newspaper article from 1901, and it described a man named William Alexander who lived on West Michigan Street, and he had just built a new home. He had torn down the log cabin he had been living in over 50 years. So he was one of the first settlers of this area, obviously, but he built what they called a modern home then. And the article concluded with, most of his life he has lived on the other side of the creek. And that sort of jumped out at me, and I liked that. And everybody knew then, you know, the newspaper that wrote the article, everybody knew what that meant, on the other side of the creek, west of Pigeon Creek. And Pigeon Creek really plays an important role here, I think, in the development of this area. So I also came across a phrase from a newspaper article in the 1940s. Periodically there are articles, some of them very long, taking up lots of pages in the newspaper about the West Side. And the one from the 1940s called it "A City Within a City," this area of town. And I agree with that too, but I sort of like on the other side of the creek better. First of all, before I really get started, I would like to thank Joan Marchand. I don't know if anyone here ever met her. She's a wonderful person. I had the privilege of working with her soon after I got out of college. I worked for a year and a half in the Historic Preservation Office downtown. And she was working there at the time and later became the director of that office. And more than anybody, there are a lot of people I know who are passionate about Evansville history. And she has to be at the top of that list. And she loved old buildings. And not just the buildings, but she'd have to research the people who lived in them too, figure out who they were, why they built, everything. And here she is, probably downtown on 1st Street somewhere, giving a tour. That's her on the left. So I have to thank her because she bequeathed her research collection to Willard. We have nearly 40 boxes of her notes and records, her research, about 60 3-ring binders stuffed full of information about different areas of the city. She was also an avid and very talented photographer. We have an estimated 4,000 pictures she took of buildings and sites around Evansville. So we owe a lot to her for helping to preserve Evansville history. This is an early map, the earliest I've seen. I'm not sure where it came from or where the original might be or much about it, except I know I found it on historicevansville.com, which is a wonderful website put together by Joe Engler, who is a West Sider and graduate of Wright High School. But this is a very early, well, that's basically the city in 1852. If you remember, a couple of years ago, Evansville celebrated its bicentennial. Evansville was founded in 1812, so this is just 4 decades later. And you can see the city's just beginning to spread out a little. It would get a big boom after the Civil War. There would be an explosion of activity, growth of population, growth of industries, and changes. But here, this is what we call the downtown area now, Main Street. So you can see the way Main Street curves here, the way it does up to North Main, and the other streets sort of angled towards the river. This area, I tried to color it in a little. I don't think everyone will see it. Well, actually, here we are right here. It says W. Carpenter, Willard Carpenter. That's where the library is. So that's if you want to orient yourself. There's a blue line I put here. It's not too visible. This area here is what they call Lamasco City at the time. And you see Pigeon Creek going up this direction, basically dividing it. In general, the area is known as Lamasco. The area west of the creek became known as Independence, which is a name that stuck around quite a while. The orange strip through the center here is Franklin, sort of through the center here. Some of the street names have changed. After this area, towards the end of the century, became completely annexed by Evansville, they had to rename some of the streets, because you have 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street down here. You have 1st Avenue, 2nd Avenue, and then up here you have 6th Street, 7th on up, and this east and west direction. This is 13th Street here on the edge, which is now St. Joseph. The streets up here, up through here, the east-west, they renamed by states, you know, like Delaware, Maryland Street, Columbia, so forth. Well, Columbia is not a state. Most of these are state names. When I was doing some research in old schools in Evansville, I read an interview by a man in the 1920s. He had come here to Evansville in 1854, about the time the public school system opened here. And he came here to take a teaching position, and he said, at that time in 1854, you could stand downtown on top of the tallest building, which is about 1.5 stories high, and see the whole city, what was in the whole city, which would have been about this much that you see here in 1852. He could see the Willard Carpenter home, which had just been built, now Channel 9 right over here, because it was a substantial home, very large. And he said, over to the west, he could see a little school building. Down here on Franklin, Franklin at Fulton, where the park is, I think it's called Fulton Park now, was a 2-story brick building in Lamasco, and across the street from where Fulton School would go later. And he noted that that building was there. Even before the public school system officially started, there was a little building there that served as a school, sort of as a meeting hall for the city of Lamasco, as it's called, Lamasco City. And how things had changed. He said beyond the creek, you could see the creek, he said beyond that it was all timber. There was just nothing. So from about this time on, things began to change though. Let's see. And some key dates to know. 1837, the city of Lamasco was platted. And it gets its name, as some of you probably know if you know anything about Evansville history. Its name comes from the first couple of letters and the last names of the 3 men who developed the area, Law, McCall, and Scott. And so they platted out this area. One of them, I think, sold the land. The early wave of German immigrants, everybody pretty much knows most of the earliest settlers in Lamasco, Independence, were of German descent. And the first wave were generally Lutherans, which is why Trinity Lutheran Church, which is just a few blocks down this way, I think on Illinois, was founded soon after the city was platted. You have Emmanuel Lutheran up here at the corner of Franklin and First Avenue. About 10 years later, both Evansville was incorporated. It became officially a city. It elected its first mayor, James Jones. Lamasco City was incorporated, but within the decade, it was annexed by Evansville. There wasn't too much resistance, maybe a little bit. There was some debate on what it should be called. The people who lived in Lamasco wanted the whole city of Evansville to take that name. Obviously, there could only be one name. Their main argument being the Ville in Evansville sounded sort of hicky, like little village, and Lamasco was more unique. And they might have had an argument there, but they lost it. Population then in La Masco was about 3,000 compared to about 7,000. So the city of Evansville had only slightly double more than what they had, and it made Evansville become, after the annexation, the second or third largest city in the state. I can't remember. A few years later, the area west of the creek, Independence, it became known as Independence because they put up a fight. They put up more of a fight. They did not want to be annexed, and there were several reasons for that, as we'll see. And I'm sorry to say it, but Willard Carpenter up there was one of the people who proposed that they be annexed. And obviously, so he was a member of the Common Council then, and obviously these Evansville leaders wanted the city to keep growing, and they saw potential. It was still a little bit early out there in that area, but they saw the potential. In fact, I came across this article in an Evansville newspaper in 1867, which is before Independence was annexed, and it mentions that in that year, 1867, there have been erected 37 houses, one business and one schoolhouse, and it's not that little one I just mentioned, in addition to steam mill used to supply lumber at the shipyard and so forth. And this is almost a prediction of what was to come. And it concludes with, these someday cannot fail to prove invaluable to the city at large. And that's true, because what we call today the West Side is really probably the major industrial corridor in the whole city after the turn of the century. So they knew what was coming. Bird's eye view. These bird's eye view maps, I'm not sure how they were able to draw them so accurately. They must have been sent up in a balloon or something. 1880, this is early. They are generally very accurate if you zero in on certain sections here. Now you see the creek going up here, and the area we'll be talking about mainly today is Independence here. This is Franklin Street. See a little bridge here. It's a little wooden bridge, covered bridge. One up here, I'm guessing that's about where Maryland is. You see some characteristics of the west side, the hills. This is probably part of Coal Mine Hill where Wright's High School would eventually go. You see a cotton mill down here, the Evansville Cotton Manufactory. You see a pond here, which is no longer there, Sweezer Pond, down where near Meade Johnson is. Here's the little bridge over Pigeon Creek on Ohio Street. You see some vacant lots here. You see, a lot of these dots you see are trees, but there are a few buildings. Now this lot right here, this is Wabash. This is Franklin, and this lot was intended to remain empty as a park. That's where the library went in 1912, the West Branch Library. However, there's a little building right here in the corner, and that was actually a hose house number 9, which was moved to 9th and Illinois or somewhere before the one was built on West Franklin Street early in the next century. So you can see a lot of interesting things, vacant lots, and in less than a decade, zeroing in a little bit more on this area, you see, sort of dark for me up here, St. Boniface Church. Centennial School's already here. The school mentioned in this 1870 article was located 1 block north of St. Boniface. That was a school that existed until Centennial was built in 1876, and after that point, that building up there was used by black students. They were shifting them around. You see a lot more buildings going up along Franklin, and it's filling in. It's starting to fill in. A lot of activity down here by the river. So roughly, when you talk about Independence, the borders are Pigeon Creek on the east, Maryland Street to the north, St. Joe to the west, and basically the Ohio River. There was just a lot of industrial activity down there. The first was probably what wasn't the very first residence in that area, but the first known one because the Hess family was very prominent. German natives, of course, like many people who came over around mid-century, but and it's really, really rare to get images of the actual people from this period, but this was in the 1880 atlas. Peter Hess and his wife. It's even more rare to see a woman's image, but these are very beloved, respected, longtime residents of Independence. I think he arrived around 1857 and he died in 1903, and when he did, he had an obituary on the first page of the newspaper, and it mentioned his house. That's his home and business. Hundreds and hundreds of people were in the house for the funeral. You see early on he combined a business. He was in the sausage making business with the house, and if this house dates from around 1857 or even a little after, it's very substantial, especially in that part of town. On a later map, later Sanborn map shows he had a slaughterhouse and sausage factory at the intersection of Franklin and St. Joe. Let's see, it would be the southwest corner. I think there's a pizza place there now and a hair salon. That's where, and it looked pretty substantial. So when you're driving by there next time, think about Peter Hess and his sausage factory. This is just a page I copied from the 1871-72 Evansville directory, the arrow showing his name, and this is a year or two after the area was annexed, but for some time it was still known by the name Independence. That's Peter Hess's name there, and it lists his address, southwest corner of 11th Avenue in Franklin. Today it's 2200 Franklin, where the First Federal Bank is. And it says Independence. Most names up here, we just assume they're Evansville because it just lists a street address. His says Independence, and I saw one other one up there somewhere. Oh, this man up here, he's a spinner, and I'm guessing he worked at the cotton mill. So I started trying to look into what brought people into this area. We know people are starting to come into the area. What did they want? What did they need to carve out a life there? Well, next few slides I show you are going to be representative of what's in the area, because I can't show you everything because there were a lot of early churches and other businesses and things, so I'm just showing you some of the better known ones. And obviously, St. Boniface is a landmark. Everybody knows where St. Boniface is, and it sort of helps you orient yourself. You can see it from a lot of places in the city. And in our own photo collection here at Willard, a lot of pictures taken downtown, especially at the river. You can tell what direction it is because you can see the spires of St. Boniface. Now, the second wave of Germans who came over after the Civil War were largely Catholics, which is why this church went up a little bit later. Opened, I think, 1883. Took a while to construct it, a couple of years, obviously. There's a school building that went up next to it in 1885. Lightning struck the spires. It burned in 1902 and was rebuilt largely in the way that it looked originally, except that they do know that the supports for the spires are taller, so it just made them taller, and it's quite an impressive building. St. Boniface basically started in the home of one of the West Siders. It was the fourth German-speaking Catholic church in Evansville. Out of the, well, let me rephrase that. It was the fourth Catholic church built in Evansville, three of which were German-speaking, had German-speaking congregations. And one of the West Side businessmen proposed that it be built. In fact, he had already built a home, and a very substantial one on Wabash Avenue, which is where houses, very large houses, would start cropping up. So we can sort of owe it to George Schulte, I think it was his name, a few other men who gathered. They were just tired of going downtown. They were members of Holy Trinity, and you know, back then when you traveled by horse and wagon, just horseback or however they traveled, that was a little trip. So, and what kinds of occupations might they have? Well, this was largely what you call a working class neighborhood. There were mechanics, there were carpenters, there were woodworkers, a lot of the Germans who came over. This is probably why the furniture factories started going up by the end of the century. For a while in the late, maybe 1900s, early 20th century, you see a lot of ads in which brag that Evansville is the furniture building capital of the world. And they might come close to that. There's no way you could ever really know for sure. But it was a major industry, and it brought a lot of workers to this part of town, or caused them to go there to live. This was the cotton mill, which actually opened downtown soon after the Civil War ended. But about 5 years later, they decided to go on down the river this is where Meade Johnson is today. In fact, Meade Johnson bought this property in 1915. I think at least one of the original buildings is still there. But so that's where it is. So that would have attracted a lot of workers out there, although a lot of them were women. Women, actually children at this time too. But a lot of West Side women worked. They worked in I read that they worked in the cotton mill, and later, right behind us, where Berry Plastics is now, that was the Fendrick cigar.
Yeah.
John Fendrick was a German himself. A lot of women worked there as rollers and stemmers, and a lot of them were domestic. So they were a working class. There were sawmills down near the river. Actually, Evansville could boast one of the 3 largest broom factories in the nation. A little bit more on that later if I can remember. There were a lot of things going on in this part of town. And one name, a lot of these names are lost to us today, but not the Wright's name, because this family really left a tremendous legacy. The schools, Wright's High School, of course, and Wright's Memorial School. John Wright's, even though he was German Catholic, well, he helped, I didn't know this until recently, he helped to start Sacred Heart on the west side for Irish Americans, even though he was German. But he was here very early, in the 1830s. That's the same decade, actually, that Willard Carpenter arrived. And a few years later, about 1845, opened this lumber yard down at Pigeon Creek and the Ohio River with his brother, who afterwards left the business. It was known as the John Augustus Wright's lumber yard, where of course he made a fortune, built the mansion that still stands downtown, preserved as a historic home. Another, as I mentioned, lumber. There was, lumber was plentiful around here, so there were lots of sawmills, and then the furniture factories that went up. I just found this picture. I liked it because it's a little dark, I guess, from age, and I pulled this off of historicevansville.com. But I liked it because here's St. Boniface, and it helps you know where this yard was located on Franklin Street, I think just east. Pardon me?
Where Teacup Block is now?
Well, I think on Franklin, just east of Pigeon Creek, although they may have moved around. But look at the lumber there. It must be very early, judging by the, well, you can just tell from the picture there. Now this area still looks familiar. This picture is dated 1909, so I know that It's the exact date, and that's Maryland Street. And Pigeon Creek, the bridge going over. It's hard to see because it's obscured. There's a horse and wagon, and you see all these furniture companies going up. The Globe, Bossy, World companies. They eventually sort of consolidated under the direction of Ben Bossy, who had been born in Scott Township to German immigrant parents. Everybody knows who he is. Went on to become one of the greatest mayors in Evansville, I think. That view still looks really familiar. You can tell what part of town that is, I think. Some of those buildings that are gone, of course. And then, even before this picture is taken, the Cargus factory, which, as you read, sadly is leaving Evansville, having been founded here in 1886. And an article I came across, it was dated, I think, several decades ago, thought that it might be one of the last, or one of the oldest operations on the west side still in existence, oldest factories, oldest any type of business, I think, that had been in continuous operation. Okay, transportation, as the city expanded in this area, Independence expanded, they needed a way to get there, and I came across this, I like that, and it happened to have been fortunately identified. A lot of old pictures are not, but it was taken at the intersection of Franklin and St. Joe. And they may be headed towards, there was the mule barn there where they parked these mules. And it was probably taken before 1892 when the streetcars became electric and they retired the mules. So that's quite an old picture. And I can barely read the writing on this building, but it says, I think, brewing. I think it's, you know, a beer brewing. As you know, the west side had a lot of breweries over time, probably owing a lot to the Germans who settled there. There's a picture of the depot, the one on Franklin Street, Central Illinois. Is that? Yeah, I get them mixed up sometimes. Still there. That's a little bit east of what the area we're primarily talking about, but that's an early picture. And that building looks great today. I think it's obviously been restored or taken care of, but that's still there. Hospitals, they needed hospitals. This is the Marine Hospital that was down on Ohio Street near the river, built around 1856, originally to serve rivermen who were down there working. It might have been easy for them to get hurt, or they might come in on a boat sick and need someplace to go. During the Civil War, I read that it was used as a convalescence home for soldiers, I guess operated by the government. Shortly after the war, it closed as a Marine hospital, but as it turned out, there were a few Daughters of Charity who had come to Evansville to help in a cholera epidemic, and as it turned out, they were able to purchase the hospital through the help of Willard Carpenter and a few other philanthropists, and that became the first St. Mary's Hospital. It was there a couple of decades before it moved to First Avenue at Columbia, which some of you may remember that building, closed in mid-1950s, and it's now out in the east side. So that building has a long history. Schools, I've already mentioned that very early school, even before the school system, opened here in Evansville out on Fulton Avenue, then one just north of St. Boniface, and then Centennial School. This is a later picture. This is taken, I think, in the 1960s. The original school would have been smaller and had a fence around it at the beginning to keep all the animals out and other potential hazards, which all the early schools had these neat little fences around them. But this school, unfortunately, did not live to see its own centennial. It has quite a history, though, and everybody probably remembers it was the first campus of Indiana State University, Evansville. And in retrospect, it's sort of a shame that it was not preserved, and I'm sure USI could probably use a few extra classrooms now anyway. But this closed, I think, 1965 as a elementary school when Helfrich Park was built just up Maryland Street. Oh, I forgot to mention the Helfrich Pottery Factory up that way too. And we have some nice pictures of men working inside that factory I should have put in here. So there were lots of, the economy, the industries out in this end of town were very diverse, and some of them quite large operations. So it's not surprising that this area grew quickly. Parks in the late 1800s, the idea or the concept of public parks was sort of novel, a space where people could just go and enjoy the greenery, the flowers, maybe the fresh air in the face of rising urbanization. And you see these women standing there where the library, West Branch Library, was situated a few decades later. Well, probably not long after that picture. That was a postcard, that's why it was in color. This was a picture, it's a twin of the one in Bayard Park, East Branch now, West Branch. Beautiful library. One of the two Carnegie, actually three, there was a third one built about a year later for blacks down on Cherry Street downtown. But one reason these were built in Evansville was a few years earlier, around 1909, a group of West Side businessmen, and they always seem to have a lot of associations boosting that end of town. They apparently contacted him and said, we need some libraries here, and they were successful, and they got one on their end of town. And it became very important, built by Clifford Shotbell, as were several buildings in this district. He was probably the preeminent Evansville architect. A lot of the buildings he built still stand, including right across the street, the old farmer's market, back here, the factory, just all sorts of buildings. But it became sort of a meeting place where people came. I read it was also used at times for classrooms when the schools got too full. Interesting, and it tells you also that West Side was always growing there. And I think the many clubs and associations met there. And in the midst of all this growing population, you need the hose house. This is not the best picture of hose house number 5 on St. Joe, just north of Franklin. But I'm using it to show you, for two reasons, to show you the bell tower, which has not been on there since about the 1930s. They were removed then, although the rest of the building is basically intact. And also to show you the flooding. We have several pictures of along West Franklin Street, this area I'm talking about. The water is very high. They were very flooded out there, thanks to Pigeon Creek. Better picture, the hose house, you see. The bell tower's gone, but it looks the way it did when it was built in 1907. This picture was taken in the 1980s, not too long before it closed. Finally, in 1988, because they built a new station up St. Joe from Maryland, I think. It was the last historic old fire station still in operation at the time, and still has some of those features that they haven't gotten rid of by now. It's still being used, thank goodness they didn't tear it down. Entertainment. I tried to think. I've seen references to a number of like little theaters. Probably the one that most people remember would be what became known as the Franklin Theater for several decades. I think that picture is taken in the 50s, judging by the car. I use this picture because there it is. That's that building. Same building, only it's been covered up the way they do when they so-called modernize things. And look how many buildings. You don't see vacant lots down here. This is probably about 1920, maybe a little earlier. You see cars and you still see horse and buggies out on the street. And you notice it's a wide street because early on, farmers came in from the western townships and traded there and socialized there. And I read that it's anywhere from 100 to 120 feet wide, whereas when you cross St. Joe on to the other side, it narrows to half that size, about 60 feet. Also in the general area was Cook's Park up near Maryland and along Pigeon Creek, the east side there. There were areas. I mean, this was a city within a city. Anything you might want to do or have to go, you had basically right there. These are just some street views I found, mostly older. It's 2200 block. And you see the streetcar coming down the middle there. It's before I don't think the boulevard went in there till at least the 1940s. In fact, I have a 1940s picture and it's still not there. So you see the streetcar coming along. This picture has always amused me and sort of baffled me. I just knew it was Franklin Street, and the only way I could identify it still took a while, was the sign here, MJ Rising Feed Company. And it took a while to find him in the city directories. Or when I did, he was living somewhere else, working somewhere else, another job. He was in liquor for a while. He was a traveling salesman, and it seems he finally settled down on Franklin Street and opened this feed company. And he was apparently there at least a decade or so. I traced him through the directories. Now, what's going on here, I am not sure. It could possibly be part of the old German Day activities, or Field Day as they called them. These are probably students from Centennial School. And I think these two buildings, which are no longer there, are about where that Harley-Davidson building is now. So they were probably torn down some time ago. But you see these students out there just doing some sort of act, and judging by the clothing, though, of the women standing in the crowd, the long dresses, this is probably before 1920. So that would have been at the later edge of, German Day, and certain of those events went out of fashion about that time because of the war. Another look down West Franklin, the 2100 block, and there's what we call today the Gerst House. That has a long history. Actually, that was a pretty early building on the stretch, an old department store. Scherfius, is that how you pronounce it? I've seen the name. The family died out a long time ago, but it was an early store too, a big department store. In fact, when it was first built, I think I have another picture, it was questioned whether or not it would succeed. It was thought to be too big to meet the needs of that community, but it turned out to be very successful and popular, and went out of business in the 1920s when the owner died. See some of the shop girls standing out here. It burned down in 1957 and Jerry's Market went in there. But it was used for different things over the years. There's also a Kroger store. Bowling alley was upstairs. A lot of different functions. A lot of these buildings along the stretch have had a lot of different functions. Franklin Street Bridge, I'm not sure which direction this is going in. And there's something contemporary looking about it, but when you look at the cars, it's probably 1930s. So I'm guessing the bridge was just built. It looks fairly modern. It's no longer those old wooden bridges that we saw earlier. Now this is a postcard as well. This is actually looking east, and it's a little bit beyond of the stretch I'm talking about. But I liked it, and one of the rare views in that direction, and the building on the left still stands. Probably nobody recognizes it because it's now a different color, it's been repainted. It's the Lamasco Bar and Grill. It was originally a grocery store. A German immigrant named Peter Detroit ran a grocery store there for about 30 years, and I don't know what it's been over the years, but it's been the Lamasco Bar and Grill for quite a while. our last general view. The photographer here had to have been standing either in the middle, the intersection of St. Joe and Franklin, or just on the other side. But this is 1943, and there's an A&P store where that pet store is now.
Yeah.
And you see all the way down, just a lot of buildings as far as the eye can see. You notice they're parking at different angles. Also, it's 1943, and although they phased out streetcars in the late 1930s, and you see the tracks have been taken out, but the boulevard has not yet been put in. But I think I read where it went in maybe later in the 1940s. So there's no particular order. I'm going to show you just a few examples of some of the buildings. One reason that this area, I think the Independence Historic District, I forgot if I mentioned it earlier, officially made the National Register in 1982. And one reason was there's so many buildings built around the turn of the century that are still there and pretty much intact. There's been very little change. And apparently they were very good quality. Many of them, if you drive down there today, look around, I mean really look around. We all take it for granted, I think, when we go down the street. We've seen it before, but when you really look at things, you see a lot of these buildings are still in great shape. I don't know about the insides of them, but this is an early view. This building was built in 1907, so this picture is taken shortly after. You see it was built by a man named Conan. He and his wife owned several properties nearby, and it was quite a large, yeah, it was a Crescent 5 and 10 store, and this is what it looks like today. Minus the Conan name up here, but it's Ben Franklin, who I think they're moving out of there now. But look at the building. Look how nice it still looks. So these more contemporary pictures you see are mostly 1980s. Some of the businesses you'll see are probably not there anymore. These were taken as part of this National Register process. The Foltz block, let me see. This one doesn't have its name. A few of the buildings along West Franklin have the builder's name still at the top. Let's see. He was an investor. He built a number of buildings. Jacob Foltz, obviously of German descent. Let's see. See what he did. Well, this was a pretty big building. It's been altered, you see down at the bottom, but it used to be able to house several stores in there. And one next door where the treasure house is, that was added a little bit later, which throws it off, throws the balance off from that rise over there on the left. But that became a Stinson Brothers store, I think, or Stinson department store, which was one of the few not locally owned. It was a regional chain, but William Stinson, who moved here to take charge of the store, stayed on, I think spent the rest of his life here, helped organize the West Side Nut Club, and he became, it seems like once you're on the West Side, you stay on the West Side, you become heavily involved. If you look at the names of men who served on committees or in different organizations, or maybe as directors of the West Side banks, you recognize a lot of the names. They were a very tight-knit, cohesive group of people. At first, one reason that I read that the residents of Independence did not want to become annexed to Evansville was they were mostly German-speaking. They wanted to preserve their culture, which they managed to do anyway. But that feeling began to change over time, and they became assimilated, and then they decided, well, they want to make sure their children do learn English and so forth. So that began to fade a little bit, but I don't think it's ever entirely left. I think people obviously are still proud of their German heritage and that into town. This is one of the first, in fact, this is one of two known buildings that was, Joan Marchand said were built during the days. It was still known as Independence, although this was early 1880s. That's actually after the annexation, but she claims it was still largely called Independence then. But the Laval block, you can see that's a huge building. If that were downtown, you know, they call Franklin Street Main Street. That Franklin is the west side's Main Street. Even if you put this downtown, our downtown now, what we call downtown, that's a substantial building. And I think originally housed 6 shops down below. And of course, you notice almost all these buildings are 2 or 3 story and no taller. And the upper floors are used as offices or often living quarters. And sometimes living quarters of the families that eventually moved out to Wabash into these huge mansions after they prospered. And a lot of them did prosper. In fact, I was reading an article about the banks, from maybe the mid-20th century, an article in the newspaper that was talking about the banks that said they both took careful care of West Siders' financial, I forget how they phrased it now, their financial well-being. It said not their financial ills because they had none. They don't need credit. We don't give credit because they don't need credit. They saved, obviously saved and prospered. Hagedorn's, which has been there a long time, Henry Hagedorn bought that business in 1936, so it does go way back. Like the Laval block, which is just a few doors down, some of the earliest buildings still standing there from that era. And this is from that 1888 bird's eye view. It shows the big Laval block and the saloon, Mundo's saloon on the corner here. And it's been used as a restaurant or saloon almost throughout its whole history, with, of course, the exception of Prohibition when it turned into an ice cream shop. But it still survived, you can see. Now this building belonged to Dr. Lorenz. He was an early pharmacist here. He became a medical doctor later, practiced downtown, but lived and worked also mostly on the west side. And his name is up in the building, it's still there.
Yeah.
And this is part of Smitty's now. I knew it looked familiar. So this would be Smitty's over here. This would be just their parking lot over here today. But even when this picture was taken in the 1980s, it was still Paul's Pharmacy. So a lot of the original uses of the buildings lingered for decades. The bank here, Old National Bank, which it's been since about 1951, but it was early on called the Franklin Savings and Trust, something like that, built around 1925. And so I guess the Old National Bank, obviously, name was added later. Look how solid that is. And made of Bedford limestone. And I've shown a little bit of the detail. These are the kinds of things the average person wouldn't think or have time to really notice, but a lot of the detailing, beautiful detail. I think the architect was from Indianapolis. Old Ben Franklin. So originally it was called the Franklin Bank. It was not because it was on Franklin Street, which I assumed, but it was in honor of old Ben Franklin here. And you can't really see him here, but on either side of him are some inscriptions, some of the quotes attributed to him. One says, "Thrift is power." The other says, "Save and succeed." So good virtues, especially for West-Siders, I think. So that building's still there. The Parnes Building, what was originally the Parnes Building, it looks like when this picture was taken on the right, it's still, I don't know how long the Sportsman's Bar and Grill's been there, but I think I saw a Schlitz sign in there, so I'm guessing it was a bar back then. It looks, like some of the buildings along the stretch, it looks like an ordinary building, a little plain, and it is, but it's solid. It's well constructed. It's really been well maintained over the years. At the top, another, the builder put his name in there, but Joan Marchand took that picture. It's a detail because she liked this brickwork, sort of a basket weave brickwork, which would be this panel here. Just a little touch, and it's light yellow, sort of buff yellow brick, which is a little different from what was used throughout the rest of the area. Now this building, again, sort of ordinary looking, still there, but it's a little significant, built by a man named Charles Werner, who used one half of it. He was in real estate, insurance, and so forth. I see here it's still used insurance as an insurance office in the 1980s, but the other half originally was a post office, which West Siders clamored for. As early as 1923, I found an article in the newspaper in which they were demanding a post office because they didn't want to have to travel to another part of town, which only made sense. And this building went up a few years later, about 1929. The Ekor Garage, originally built by a man, I think, is it Robert Ekor? Anyway, whoops, 1923. Speed this up just a little. He sold Fords and Lincolns. Apparently he went bankrupt during the Depression, but another car dealership bought the building. I guess Weber Equipment has been there a long time. They're still there. They were there in the 80s. This was sort of a different kind of building. The garage door on the far right, there was a ramp in there leading up to the second floor where you drove your cars. And this building, I saw a picture of the architect's drawing in the 1923 article about this being built, and it looks almost identical. Very little change. And we have to, of course, mention this beautiful building, which I think Joan Marchand says is possibly the most important commercial building left in Evansville. I won't go into a lot of detail here because I don't want to run out of time, but you can just look at the detail. Some of this is metal work. She could never definitely prove it, but she thinks it's probably from the Mesker Steel Company, which was nationally famous. They sent out work all over the country. The Illinois Preservation Agency in recent years has been working on an inventory of all the Mesker storefronts around the country. This could be one, even if it's not. And it makes sense that it would be. Mesker started here in Evansville. It's still a beautiful building. It was originally the Rosenberger building for about the first 30 years. It was built in 1890 by Gooserosenberger, used as a grocery. There's the side. So you can see how massive it is, which I'm sure everybody's aware of anyway. But apparently, 4 years after he built the building, he built an adjoining warehouse the same size, the same dimensions, and that was raised in the 1940s, but can you imagine? And he was so successful, he opened up stores in Oakland, California, Wichita, Kansas, and Baltimore. And he eventually moved to Wichita, but visited family and friends here in Evansville occasionally up through his death, I think in the late 20s or early 30s. But Rosenberger Avenue, he built one of the beautiful mansions on Wabash. You see is on the side of the building, I think that's what I was trying to show, it's obscure. You see the name still up there. That's the way the store looks. Somebody took this picture in the early around 1984, I think it was dated. So it's a wonderful picture. And Joan Marchand said it's in, and I think it still is. I mean, she wrote this 30 years ago, but she said it was in this building, inside and outside, is in near pristine condition. They have so well preserved it. And the next owners, Helt and Velker, who had this hardware company, continue to respect that. And I think the current owners, I don't know who owns it, but when you walk into this building, you just feel like you step back into time. The West Franklin Bank building, still there. Originally the West Side Bank, built around 1906. You see the Simpson United Methodist Church down here in the corner. This was where the old Peter Hess house was. When they built the bank, they built this 2-story brick duplex for extra income, smart thinking. The building looks virtually the same today. And I was talking about the West Siders being tight-knit and supporting of each other. I'm sorry, I had to throw this picture in, but when Mesker Zoo was built around this time, another great West Side institution, that's the Animal House. Here's Wasiba, I don't know how he pronounced it, a famous chimp. They had a lot of chimps at that time. And this one, they named after West Side Bank. That's where they got the name from. They gave the zoo the money to buy this chimp who was one of the chief attractions at the zoo. Now he has just finished christening the new monkey boat. I have another picture of him holding the bottle, but here he is sitting down taking some tea or something. I do have a program on the early years of Mesker Zoo. We have hundreds of photos like this. And, if you're ever interested, I think I'm showing that one in August. So, and we're about done here. Just a few residences, a view up Wabash, and of course, it's always recognizable by St. Boniface Church. I think this is the early school building I mentioned that was built around 1867 and used until Centennial was built. You see houses are going up. Here it is in 1936 when the boulevard is being put in. This is a WPA crew. This is when a lot of curb repairs, street repairs were made in Evansville during the Depression. You see the church over here. This was this Anthony Klein was a brother-in-law of the Rosenberger family who had the, what's now the Gerst building, the grocery chain. And this building is still there. I checked it out today. I wasn't sure because it's obscured by large bushy trees in front of it. And since the 1980s, it's been used as a fraternity house, I think, right here on the side. But it's still there, and it's still recognizable. But this is a 1901 view. But look at this house. It's like anything that you'd find down on Southeast 1st Street or Southeast Riverside Drive. It's monstrous, and it's beautiful. 409 Wabash, the Rosenberger home. Still there. That's an early view on the left. You can see some slight alterations. I drove that by the other day and it looked like maybe some more work's being done. A ladder was up. I mean, that house is kept up and it's still beautiful. The Reitman home, which was torn down about 20 years ago. An Italian, whoops. Well, actually, this is just like this. These two houses were a block apart. Unfortunately, both are now gone. This is the Charles Schulte who helped get St. Boniface organized. Look at the size of that home. It's identical, really, to the Reitman home. They were both partners together in a sawmill down by the river and obviously made a lot of money. And those are two of the earliest homes built on Wabash. The tower, the Reitman home also had a tower, but it was removed after lightning struck it. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what was there. If Franklin is the main street of the Independence area, then Wabash is the southeast, 1st Street, Riverside area where the big mansions are, big, beautiful buildings. So I want to read just one last thing, just take a minute. This is from Joan, oh well, I need that anyway. Joan Marchand's book. This came out in 1989, published by the city, the West Franklin Street Historic District. Inside she calls it the Independence Historic District, it's the same thing. But at the beginning, she writes a historical overview, and I just want to conclude with her comments here, if I have any voice left. She says, like other traditional shopping hubs, West Franklin Street faces increased competition from commercial development on the city's outskirts. This is written in 1989 or so. Yet the district retains a charm and vitality not found in modern suburban commercial centers. Its spruced up buildings and attractive landscaping and its small town atmosphere within the larger city, the feeling of a place where neighbors still greet one another and feel comfortably at home, make historic West Franklin Street as pleasant a destination for today's generation of West Siders as it was for their forebears. So, and I think they've done a wonderful job of preserving that feeling. So that's my program, and thank you.